Greetings to all our viewers tuning into our channel. There are moments in history when a document, seemingly dry, packed with technical jargon, carries more weight than an entire armored division, more force than a fleet of aircraft carriers. Because sometimes it's in those silent lines of text that an empire sketches out its true ambitions, not through rallying cries or flowery speeches, but through strategy. And strategy is always cold, precise, and sharp, like a blade capable of altering the course of the world. When the US government released the 2025 National Security Strategy, many people skimmed past it as just another routine update, like every NSS that came before. But for those who took the time to read it line by line, paragraph by paragraph, it felt like opening a secret door inside the White House, one that doesn't deal in polished statements for the press, but bluntly identifies enemies, targets, fears, and ambitions that America is willing to risk everything to achieve. The NSS 2025 isn't a policy announcement. It's a confession from a superpower confronting a hard truth. For the first time in nearly a century, the US no longer holds absolute dominance over its primary rival. The document reveals a deep-seated anxiety that American power is eroding by the day, and if Washington doesn't act now, a future where the US no longer sits atop the global power pyramid could become reality within just a few decades. This isn't an exaggeration. It's a warning written by some of America's top strategic thinkers. And within those very pages, one can sense a quiet but resolute shift in Washington's strategic mindset. Gone are the familiar slogans about spreading democracy, defending freedom, or building a better world. NSS 2025 doesn't speak of ideals. It speaks of power and how to reclaim it. It speaks of adversaries and how to weaken them. It speaks of hegemony and how to preserve it at all costs. The post-2025 world no longer runs on the order we once knew. Power blocks are fragmenting, once unshakable alliances are starting to tremble, and extreme protectionism and fierce national interest are rising rapidly. No one says it out loud, but most can feel it. A new era of superpower competition is emerging, a new Cold War, more complex, multi-layered, and far more dangerous than the last. NSS 2025 is the roadmap to that era. Within that context, China looms like a shadow over every decision in the document. Not Russia, not Iran, not the traditional enemies often cited in political discourse. All of them fade in comparison to China, a rival Washington sees as too powerful to subdue, yet too dangerous to ignore. Every goal, every policy, every adjustment revolves around one question. How can America remain the most powerful empire on Earth while China is accelerating at a pace even the Pentagon didn't anticipate? That's why NSS 2025 is more than just a document. It's a declaration of a global power restructuring. It sketches a world where the US seeks to reduce dependence, regain control over its spheres of influence, encircle its strategic rival, and build a new power network stretching from Mexico to Japan, from Panama to Taiwan. It shows that America is not retreating. It is stepping into a prolonged phase of confrontation, one that the entire world will have to pay for. Yet the most striking part isn't what's written in the document, but how it's been misunderstood. In the days following its release, many major Western outlets excitedly reported that the US was preparing to pull back, withdraw from international commitments, and return to isolationism. They painted a distorted picture of a Washington weary of global leadership, yearning to focus inward. But that was just the surface, a surface riddled with misinterpretation. And it's from that misunderstanding that we now need to move into the next section, to understand why Western media misread the most dangerous strategy America has written in years, and why that misconception might cost the world dearly. The moment the 2025 National Security Strategy was released, a wave of rushed interpretations swept through newsrooms in Washington, New York, London, and Brussels. Headlines across Western media all echoed the same message. America wants to retreat from the world, Trump returns to isolationism, Washington pulls back to the Western Hemisphere. These titles quickly created the illusion that the empire, which had led the global order for nearly a century, was now preparing to walk away from its role. Some commentators even likened this to a post-imperial phase, as if America had grown weary of endless wars and was ready to hand the global stage over to other rising powers. But the truth lies far beneath those shallow interpretations. Western media, long accustomed to the mindset of America as the world's guardian, failed to recognize a fundamental shift in Washington's strategic thinking. They saw the U.S. reducing commitments in Europe, scaling down its presence in the Middle East, cutting funding to multilateral institutions, and quickly concluded that America was in retreat. Yet in the NSS 2025, there isn't a single mention of retreat. There are only two words that run through every page: reallocation and repositioning. America isn't leaving the world, America is reshaping it. And that is the critical point Western media missed. They viewed this strategic shift with outdated lenses, using Cold War-era frameworks to interpret a strategy designed for a new Cold War, one where economics, technology, supply chains, and geopolitical influence intertwine like a global nervous system. They assumed that when the U.S. reduced its role in Europe or the Middle East, it meant giving up leadership. In reality, Washington is simply withdrawing resources from fronts that no longer matter as much, to concentrate them where the real existential showdown is unfolding: the competition with China. This misreading is dangerous because it causes many nations to misjudge the strategic environment around them. Europe thinks the U.S. no longer cares, when in fact, it's simply been downgraded to a secondary front. The Middle East assumes Washington is tired and letting go, when in truth, the region no longer holds the strategic weight it once did. And Latin American countries naively believe they'll be more free when NSS 2025 makes it crystal clear. Washington views the Western Hemisphere as an untouchable backyard and is preparing to tighten its grip like never before. What's most striking is that nearly all the major Western media outlets overlooked the central, ultimate goal emphasized throughout the document: the preservation of U.S. global dominance, at any cost. They failed to see it, or perhaps chose not to, because acknowledging this would mean admitting that America is not entering an era of humility, but gearing up for an era of hard power, more determined, more aggressive, and more willing to act decisively in the face of any challenge. And when the fog of misinterpretation finally lifts, what stands clear, clearer than ever, is the central question Washington poses, a question NSS 2025 answers without ambiguity. What must America do to remain the strongest, wealthiest, and most powerful nation in human history? From here, we move into the next part, where that ultimate goal is laid bare: the ambition to preserve American global hegemony, and how Washington is preparing every tool at its disposal to make that ambition a reality. From the very first pages of the 2025 National Security Strategy, one thing is made crystal clear: America is not hiding its ambition. No metaphors, no roundabout language. Washington stated bluntly that the United States must remain the strongest, wealthiest, most powerful nation in human history. This isn't just a strategic stance, it's the ideological foundation upon which the entire American policymaking system is built. From the White House to the Pentagon, from the Treasury Department to the Department of Commerce, everything revolves around a single, unchanging goal: maintaining global hegemony, not through morality, but through power. A closer reading of the document reveals a crucial shift. The U.S. no longer separates military power from economic power, as it did in the early 21st century. These two forces have now been fused into a single unified structure of influence. The U.S. military protects trade routes, while the American economy fuels the fleet and drives military technology. Big tech corporations have become the new arms of the White House, and economic alliances now serve as extensions of national security strategy. All of it converges toward one supreme objective: to surpass every potential rival, especially China. The truth is, the U.S. has never feared Russia the way it fears China. Russia may be strong militarily, but it's economically weak. Russia has nuclear weapons, but it cannot threaten the global financial system. It can cause instability, but it can't rewrite the rules of the world order. China is different. Beijing not only holds the world's second largest economy, but is also advancing technologically at a pace that has outstripped all expectations, even those of U.S. intelligence agencies. From artificial intelligence and telecommunications to renewable energy, semiconductors, and industrial robotics, China is surging ahead in ways that deeply unsettle Washington. If the U.S. falls even one step behind, it risks losing its leadership in several critical sectors. That's why America's hegemonic ambition is so tightly linked to its obsession with reindustrialization. The US understands that a superpower cannot dominate the world if it depends on a rival to produce its steel, chips, pharmaceuticals, or clean energy. Bringing jobs back isn't just a campaign slogan. It's part of a larger effort to reclaim the material foundation of national strength. The US wants to use technology to rebuild its manufacturing base, to turn AI into a new economic engine, and to ensure that every vital link in the global supply chain falls under American control. But the bigger the ambition, the greater the challenge. And among all those challenges, there is one vulnerability that even the NSS 2025 cannot hide. America is more dependent on China than at any other point in its history. From strategic minerals to component manufacturing, from low-end semiconductors to basic industrial materials, the US economy, no matter how powerful, is still tethered to China's vast production machine. This creates a bitter paradox. The US must maintain hegemony, but to do so, it has to reduce its reliance on its greatest rival. And in order to reduce that dependence, Washington must accept a hard truth. It cannot launch a direct confrontation with China, at least not in the short term. And this is where the story becomes more complex, more layered, and more dangerous. Because before it can rebuild national strength, the US must first resolve this fatal weakness. And that weakness isn't in a Washington boardroom or in Silicon Valley's financial statements. It lies in the farthest reaches of the global map, embedded in the sprawling supply chains that run through China. Which brings us to the next chapter. To understand why America cannot go to war with China at this moment, why the 2025 trade war collapsed so spectacularly, and why supply chains have become the critical weak point that could shake the very foundations of America's hegemonic ambition. At first glance, it's easy to be impressed by America's overwhelming military might. Dozens of aircraft carriers, a network of bases spanning 5 continents, and a defense budget larger than the combined military spending of many other nations. But no matter how massive that power may seem, it cannot conceal a silent yet dangerous truth. The US economy is dependent on China to a degree that even Washington is reluctant to admit. This isn't just about cheap consumer goods or everyday electronics. America's critical vulnerability lies much deeper, in the very foundations of the modern economy. Strategic minerals, semiconductor components, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, and thousands of specialized materials essential to every industrial sector. When China controls the majority of the global supply of rare earth elements, from neodymium for electric motors to dysprosium for guided missiles, it means that for the US to maintain its status as a superpower, it must rely on resources far outside its own grasp. In 2025, the trade war that Washington had hoped would break China ended up delivering a painful blowback instead. Tariffs as high as 60 to 100% didn't drive supply chains out of China. They simply raised the prices of goods within the US American companies, from chip makers and battery producers to those in renewable energy, faced severe shortages of key components. Costs soared, operations stalled, and most critically, the dream of reindustrialization began to falter. The figure most often mentioned during that period was Scott Bessent, the White House's hardline trade advisor. He had once declared that the global supply chain must be severed from China at all costs. But after Beijing retaliated by restricting exports of rare earths and strategic materials, the US began to understand what at all costs really meant. A single export ban from China was enough to paralyze entire sectors of American industry within weeks. Suddenly, voices calling for war or direct confrontation went quiet, quieter than ever. War games conducted by the Pentagon simulated a chilling scenario. The US might win at sea, but its economy would collapse the moment war began. Not because of missiles, not because of submarines, but because the supply chains would fall apart. No rare earths, no batteries, no components, no electronics. The US military would be left blind and deaf within months. This is why Washington has had to accept a hard truth. It cannot launch a full-scale war with China this decade. Not because America is weak, but because the global production system has bound its economy to China like 2 gears interlocked. Try to move one, and the whole machine groans under the strain. This dependency isn't the result of a recent mistake. It's the product of over 3 decades of globalization, during which American corporations willingly shifted factories to China to cut costs. And now, the US faces a brutal paradox. In order to maintain hegemony, it must dismantle the very system it helped build. But how? Where will it rebuild? How do you relocate millions of jobs, thousands of factories? That's when the idea of Fortress America emerged in the NSS 2025. A bold, high-stakes plan to rebuild the entire supply chain within the Western Hemisphere, where the US can control, influence, or manipulate production as needed. This strategy isn't just about reducing dependency on China. It's about economically recolonizing Latin America, transforming the region into a new factory floor to fuel American power. And to understand why the US chose this path, why the factories can't simply return from China to American soil, and why Latin America has become an irreplaceable target, we now turn to the next section, where the strategy to reconstruct supply chains in the Western Hemisphere is revealed in all its ambition and cold calculation. When the United States realized it couldn't sever ties with China through tariff shocks or military threats, Washington shifted toward a new mindset, bolder, more pragmatic. If it couldn't force supply chains out of China through raw power, then it would build an entirely new supply chain universe, right within the Western Hemisphere, where America holds absolute advantages in geography, politics, and military might. Thus, the idea of Fortress America was born, not just as a slogan, but as a comprehensive strategy to rebuild the economic foundation of the United States. At the heart of this thinking lies a key realization. China became the world's factory, not just because of cheap labor, but because it built a complete, highly efficient industrial ecosystem, something the US cannot replicate within its own borders. Industries like textiles, electronics, chemicals, components, batteries, and steel left the US decades ago, and they can't be brought back with tax breaks alone. There's no labor force large enough, no continuous manufacturing tradition, no network of auxiliary suppliers, no streamlined logistical system like China's. The US understands that trying to bring everything back home would burn through trillions of dollars and still likely fail. So the middle ground solution became clear. Move the supply chains from China to Latin America, close enough to control, cheap enough to manufacture, and dependent enough for Washington to shape the region's economic policies at will. This is the true nature of the friend-shoring and near-shoring strategies that Washington promotes. Not about building friendly supply chains, but about economically recolonizing the Western Hemisphere to serve US power. Countries like Mexico, Colombia, Brazil, Peru, Guatemala, and Honduras suddenly became hotspots for a wave of American corporate relocation. A quiet but determined exodus of factories from China to Mexico began. Industrial zones in Monterrey, Tijuana, and Hermosillo expanded rapidly. US companies were searching for a light version of China. Close to the border, easy to control, and without strategic ambitions to challenge Washington. Latin America became the ideal region for 3 key reasons. First, labor costs are far lower than in the US. Second, geographic proximity allows goods to be shipped by land instead of sea, reducing strategic risk. And third, most crucially, these countries remain heavily dependent on the US for aid, trade, and security. In other words, if Washington wants to steer policy, it holds all the levers. This leads to a truth few in the West dare to say out loud. With its new strategy, the US doesn't want factories to come back to America. It wants them to come back to America's sphere of influence. This is the new model of economic hegemony, where the US controls the brain, technology, finance, design, while Latin America provides the hands. Washington keeps the profits. The global South supplies the labor. But to execute such a massive plan, the US needs one essential condition: absolute political stability across the Western Hemisphere. Any country leaning toward China or Russia becomes a threat to America's new factory floor. And this is where economic strategy collides with geopolitical strategy. To turn the Western Hemisphere into a foundation for 21st century American military and economic power, the US can't rely on trade deals alone. Washington needs a new order, an order in which every nation from Mexico to Argentina falls firmly within the US security orbit, just as they did during the Cold War. Because if the new supply chains are the backbone of Fortress America, then the entire continent must be an invulnerable zone. And this is where NSS 2025 takes a dramatic turn from economic strategy to a strategy of power and control. Because in order to rebuild supply chains in the Western Hemisphere, the US must do something far greater: reestablish total dominance over the Americas, just as it did in the last century. That's when a ghost from history returns, standing at the heart of this new strategy, the Monroe Doctrine. But not the 19th century version. This is its modern, hardened interventionist reincarnation, what Washington now calls the Trump corollary. And that is the gateway to our next chapter, where the US prepares to reconquer the entire American continent through a calculated mix of economic pressure, sanctions, coups, and military force. When the United States realized that rebuilding supply chains within the Western Hemisphere would first require absolute control over the region, politically, economically, and militarily, Washington began to reactivate a doctrine long thought to belong in a museum: the Monroe Doctrine. But this is no longer the original 1823 version, a polite warning for Europe to stay out of the Americas. This is a 21st century version, stronger, more direct, and with shades of a new semi-colonial order. Washington has given it a name befitting the times: the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. In this updated version, the US doesn't just prohibit other powers from expanding influence in the Western Hemisphere. It goes further. Any country in the region that deepens cooperation with China, Russia, or Iran is now considered a direct threat to US national security. This marks a sharp escalation from the original Monroe Doctrine. Where the old version rejected outside interference, the new one embraces internal intervention through financial sanctions, diplomatic coercion, regime change, and the installation of US-friendly governments when necessary. Documents within NSS 2025 lay it out clearly. Washington will sweep clean Chinese influence from the Americas by any means necessary. Infrastructure projects funded by Beijing, mining agreements, and forward operating bases. China has quietly built in the South Pacific and the Caribbean. All are viewed as direct threats to the Fortress America plan. And to eliminate those threats, Washington knows it needs more than economic pressure. It needs a full-spectrum architecture of control. Take Argentina, for example, a nation recently plunged into economic crisis and caught between Beijing and Washington. While China seeks to turn Argentina into a hub for energy and agriculture, the US sees it as one of the most strategic positions in the Western Hemisphere. When a new government tilted toward the US came to power, Washington quickly ramped up its influence. That wasn't a coincidence, it was a coordinated strategy. In Ecuador, the US exploited domestic unrest to push new security agreements, effectively neutralizing Chinese involvement in tech and infrastructure projects. Panama, home to the canal that remains vital to global trade, became a high-stakes front. When China attempted to gain control over key ports, the US intervened immediately, pressuring the Panamanian government to review and reverse its contracts with Beijing. NSS 2025 makes this point unambiguously clear. The Panama Canal must never fall into any foreign power other than the United States. Venezuela is a microcosm of this broader confrontation. China has poured billions into Venezuela's oil sector, turning Caracas into a strategic ally. For the US, that is unacceptable. Washington sees Venezuela as a deliberate destabilizer, a place where China can use oil, technology, and financing to break the US encirclement. As a result, NSS 2025 is candid in listing Venezuela as an open battlefield, where the US is prepared to use both hard and soft power to shift the balance. The American playbook is now clear. Weaken anti-US governments through sanctions, strengthen pro-US regimes through aid and investment, dismantle Chinese, Russian, and Iranian influence networks through intelligence operations, and reserve military force as the final threat if all else fails. This is Washington's 21st century reinterpretation of the Monroe Doctrine, not as a shield against intervention, but as a web of control draped across the entire Western Hemisphere. But behind the facade of protecting U.S. national security lies a truth spelled out in the strategic annexes of NSS 2025. To build an industrial economic fortress, America needs resources it no longer possesses in sufficient quantities: cheap oil, rare earths, lithium, cobalt, nickel, copper, silver, gold, uranium, all the essential ingredients of a modern empire. And most of those resources aren't within US borders. They're scattered across South America. In other words, the US doesn't just want to control the continent geopolitically, it wants to own its energy and mineral wealth. Without these resources, Fortress America is nothing more than an empty slogan. Without lithium from the Lithium Triangle, oil from Venezuela, or strategic minerals from Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia, the dream of breaking free from Chinese dependence remains just that, a dream. And it's from this point that the story plunges deeper into harsher, sharper, and more revealing terrain. Because when an empire seeks to preserve power, it's not looking for stability, it's looking for resources. Resources to fuel industry, run armies, and shape the future. That's why the next chapter opens like a cold steel door. What does America really want from Latin America? The answer can be summed up in 3 words: oil, lithium, minerals. And to understand why those 3 elements are the keystones of the entire US strategy for the 21st century, we now turn to the next section. A deep dive into the technical annexes of the 2025 National Security Strategy reveals a stark reality. The entire Fortress America plan will collapse if Washington cannot secure one critical element: resources. Not just any resources, but the ones that form the backbone of the 21st century economy: oil, lithium, and strategic minerals. That's why the US doesn't merely aim to control the Western Hemisphere politically, it wants to dominate its natural wealth, much like ancient empires once conquered fertile lands to sustain their might. Venezuelan oil is the prime example. With the largest proven reserves on the planet, the country should be wealthy and stable. But to Washington, Venezuela represents something far more crucial. It is the reserve engine for America's reindustrialization plan. If the U.S. wants to reduce dependence on the Middle East, ensure energy security for manufacturing, and maintain a military ready for sustained conflict, it needs to control an oil supply close to home. This is why the U.S. has never abandoned efforts to change the regime in Caracas. Any leader who leans toward Beijing becomes a target without exception. Then there's lithium, the white gold of the electric vehicle and battery age. The Lithium Triangle. Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia holds over 60% of the world's lithium reserves. For more than a decade, China has poured investment into the region, building mines, battery plants, and transportation networks. For the US, this is unacceptable. If China controls lithium, it controls the global EV industry, an industry Washington sees as the spearhead of the 21st century. That's why NSS 2025 sets an explicit goal to regain privileged access to the Lithium Triangle, supporting pro-US governments and dismantling Chinese mining deals wherever possible. Beyond lithium, the US is targeting cobalt, copper, nickel, and other critical minerals in Brazil, Peru, and Bolivia. These aren't just industrial materials, they're the foundations of AI, missiles, radar systems, military-grade batteries, chip production, and satellites. In short, they're the future of modern warfare. And as long as China dominates refining and exports, the US understands one thing: unless it shifts the balance in South America, it will remain dependent on Beijing. Behind all American interventions in the region lies a clear logic. Whoever controls resources controls technology. Whoever controls technology controls the 21st century. In the race for dominance, resources are not just a means, they are power itself. But America also understands a sobering truth. Even total control over the Western Hemisphere won't be enough to preserve its superpower status. Not if it loses the most important front of all, the Asia-Pacific. Across every strategic report, from the Pentagon to the CIA, from the State Department to the National Security Council, the answer is always the same. The future of the world will not be decided in South America. It does not lie in the lithium deserts or oil fields of Venezuela. The future lies in the Pacific, where the US and China are locked in a spiraling contest for survival, where a single miscalculation could shake the entire century. And it's here that the story pivots dramatically. Latin America is merely the strategic rear. The true battlefield is the Asia-Pacific. This is where the US seeks to encircle China, where its allies become the front lines, and where the defining power struggle of the 21st century will play out. To understand why this stretch of ocean has become the centerpiece of global strategy, we must now move into the next chapter, where island chains, maritime choke points, and technological arms races converge into the largest front of the century. If Latin America is the strategic rear, then the Asia-Pacific is where every thread of the 25 national security strategy converges. Because here, for the first time in generations, the United States faces a rival with enough military, economic, and technological power to challenge its status as the world's dominant superpower. And unlike previous adversaries, whether it was the Soviet Union, Japan, or even Europe, China is competing on every front simultaneously, making the Asia-Pacific the epicenter of the greatest power struggle of the 21st century. From Washington's perspective, the most dangerous scenario is not that China surpasses the US in GDP, but that it builds a sphere of influence across East Asia, Southeast Asia, and the entire South China Sea. If that happens, the US would be pushed out of the Pacific, lose control over critical maritime routes, and see its influence in the global trading system erode. That would mark the beginning of irreversible American decline. That's why the US has identified the Asia-Pacific as a do-or-die battleground, the place where a superpower either holds its ground or loses everything. From this point forward, Washington has constructed a sweeping strategy known among analysts as the Grand Encirclement. This encirclement stretches from Japan and South Korea through Taiwan and the Philippines down to Singapore, across to Australia, and finally into the Indian Ocean. It's not just a military alliance, it's a web of technology cooperation, infrastructure investment, intelligence sharing, and supply chain integration. At the core of this encirclement lie the first and second island chains, critical lines of defense. The first island chain, running from Japan through Okinawa, Taiwan, and the Philippines, is the front line, where the US aims to contain China's navy within the near seas. The second island chain, stretching from Guam to the Marianas, serves as a forward operating line where US bases can strike deep into the Chinese mainland if needed. These positions are linked by radars, satellites, air bases, and nuclear submarines, forming the densest surveillance and strike network the Pacific has ever seen. But what worries the US most isn't just the number of Chinese warships, but the speed of Beijing's technological rise. Anti-ship ballistic missiles, stealth aircraft, space warfare satellites, military-grade AI, long-range sensors, all are developing faster than the Pentagon expected. As technology accelerates, warfare is no longer about naval battles. It's a contest of systems. Who controls the electronic sky? Who dominates digital infrastructure? Who can disrupt the enemy's supply chain first? This is 21st century warfare, where the military is just the visible tip of the iceberg, while economics and technology form the massive hidden base beneath the surface. That's why the US is doubling down on its partnership with Japan, its most trusted spearhead in East Asia. Tokyo is rearming at a pace not seen since World War II, and that is no accident. In confidential reports, Washington sees Japan as the only country in the region with the technology, capital, and political will to contain China over the long term. The Philippines has become the southern linchpin of the first island chain, with U.S. forces returning to Luzon, setting up bases in Palawan, and expanding presence in the northern islands. Washington is forming a southern pincer aimed at locking down the Bashi Channel, a vital maritime artery for China's access to the Pacific. That's why Beijing reacts furiously whenever Manila hosts another American military delegation. Australia and India, meanwhile, serve different but critical roles. Canberra is being transformed into a forward military depot under AUKUS, with nuclear submarines and long-range surveillance systems. India, though not a formal ally, remains a natural counterweight to Chinese influence in the Indian Ocean. Washington knows New Delhi may never fully align with the US, but as long as India doesn't tilt toward China, America's encirclement strategy holds. Yet, among all these flashpoints, one place sits at the eye of the storm: Taiwan. Not just because of its crucial geographic location, though that alone is vital, but because of something even more precious than oil, gold, or rare earths: semiconductors produced by TSMC. The US knows that if Taiwan falls into Chinese hands, Beijing would gain control of the most critical supply chain on Earth, and with it, the entire US military posture in the Pacific would lose its strategic coherence. That's why Washington sees Taiwan as the circuit breaker of global conflict, a place that could flip the world toward peace or shut it off entirely and plunge it into chaos. And now, to understand why Taiwan holds such immense weight, why it stands as the hinge of the global order, and why the US is determined to prevent Chinese unification with the island at all costs, we turn to the next chapter. In all of the strategic documents the United States has released over the past 30 years, no single issue has been mentioned with the frequency and intensity seen in NSS 2025 regarding Taiwan. To Washington, Taiwan is not merely a disputed political entity, nor just the Western anchor of the first island chain. It is a circuit breaker where a single flip, on or off, could thrust the world into fragile peace or plunge it into a spiral of war. Taiwan's importance does not lie in its size or population, but in something invisible yet central to the entire global economic infrastructure: semiconductors. TSMC, the world's most advanced chipmaker, controls roughly 90% of the global market for chips under 7 nanometers. These chips power everything from supercomputers, fighter jets, satellites, and industrial robots to AI systems and America's most sophisticated weapons. That means if China gains control of Taiwan, Beijing would effectively control the beating heart of the global tech industry. For the US, this isn't just a national security concern, it's an existential threat. The fall of Taiwan wouldn't only shift the military balance, it would also place the future of the world's economy directly into Beijing's hands. That's why Washington is unwilling and unable to accept such a scenario. Strategic advisors in the White House have put it bluntly: if Taiwan falls, every layer of America's encirclement of China becomes irrelevant. Without Taiwan, the first island chain collapses. U.S. forces in Japan and the Philippines lose their ability to block China's Pacific access. Maritime supply routes become fragile, and America's technological edge is struck at its very core. That's why the U.S. has turned Taiwan into a strategic trident, alongside Japan and the Philippines. Japan is boosting defense spending, developing long-range missiles, and deploying wide-area radar systems. The Philippines is reopening bases in Luzon, Palawan, and the Northern Islands to host U.S. forces. Meanwhile, Washington is ramping up arms sales, transferring defense technology, and training Taiwan's military, all aimed at a single objective: make any Chinese invasion too costly to attempt. But here lies the paradox. While America wants to preserve the status quo, China sees unification with Taiwan as a non-negotiable ultimate goal. For Beijing, only with Taiwan's return can it achieve its national rejuvenation, end the historical divide, and, most crucially, break the strategic encirclement imposed by the United States. That's why the Taiwan Strait has become the most dangerous flashpoint on Earth, where any change is perceived by both sides as a direct threat to their future. The strait now resembles a tightly stretched wire. Each live-fire drill, each warship standoff, every time a Chinese fighter crosses the median line, the wire trembles, thins, and draws closer to the moment of rupture. And when that wire snaps, the world will not simply face a war. It will face a total restructuring of the global order on a scale unseen in modern history. Against this backdrop, Taiwan is no longer just a key node in America's China containment strategy. It is the hinge upon which the entire 21st century may turn. That's why Washington is investing not only in military infrastructure, but also in a broad diplomatic architecture around the island. Japan stands as the northern pillar. The Philippines blocks the south. And beyond that, the U.S. is drawing in Australia, the U.K., Canada, and European partners into a coalition to defend freedom of navigation around Taiwan. Yet behind all these massive strategic movements, a quieter force is positioning itself, collaborating with the U.S., keeping a measured distance, balancing against China without fully opposing it. That force is India. And why does New Delhi act as a double-edged sword, both a key partner for the U.S. and a challenge to its own strategy? That question leads us to the next chapter, where India enters the great geopolitical game as an independent power, unwilling to choose sides, yet capable of tipping the regional balance in any direction it chooses. Amid the escalating US-China rivalry, India has emerged as a unique force. Not an ally, not an adversary, but an independent power with its own ambitions. Washington has repeatedly tried to draw New Delhi into its strategic orbit, viewing India as a natural counterweight to China in South Asia and the Indian Ocean. But anyone who closely follows Indian politics knows one thing: New Delhi will never allow itself to become just a part of any great power's plan. not even America's. India's foreign policy is anchored in a single core principle: strategic autonomy. And that makes India a double-edged sword for Washington. On one hand, New Delhi stands shoulder to shoulder with the US, joining the Quadrilateral Dialogue, Quad, ramping up naval exercises, expanding defense cooperation. Yet on the other hand, India continues to buy cheap Russian oil, maintain deep military ties with Moscow, and never publicly take sides in the US-China competition. To Washington, India is both a strategic anchor in its Indo-Pacific framework and a highly unpredictable variable. New Delhi is willing to cooperate when interests align, but will veer off course the moment it senses Washington trying to exert too much influence or infringe on its domestic policies. This is why the US cannot bind India into a traditional alliance model like Japan or Australia. India carries historical grievances with China, from the 1962 border war to the bloody Ladakh clashes in 2020, and these have pushed New Delhi closer to Washington on regional security matters. But conversely, India also knows it cannot burn bridges with China, as Beijing remains its largest trading partner and a powerful neighbor directly across its borders. The crux of the matter is this: India does not want to become the front line in a war it didn't start. It's willing to contain China, but not at the cost of its economy or security, and certainly not to serve America's strategic agenda. Therefore, the US is forced into a delicate dance, offering India incentives, market access, defense technology transfers, semiconductor cooperation, and energy deals, just to ensure New Delhi stays in the not China camp. In NSS 2025, India is not described as an ally, but as an essential partner. And that wording is no accident. It reflects the reality. India fights for its own interests. When those interests align with Washington's, they become temporary allies. But when their priorities diverge, India has no qualms about stepping back to maintain balance. Looking at India's role reveals the truly multipolar nature of the 21st century. Gone are the hardline alliances of the Cold War. What we have now are fluid, transactional relationships shaped by timing and self-interest. And that's something the US, accustomed to leading loyal coalitions, must learn to adapt to. Yet if India is a half-in, half-out partner, then Europe stands in an entirely different position, an aging continent, drained by the war in Ukraine, increasingly dependent on the US, and caught in a web of strategic choices it no longer truly controls. And here, the story turns to a new chapter, a chat tinged with bitterness. Europe is becoming the one left behind in the brutal contest of giants. For decades, Europe believed it was the center of the world, the cradle of Western civilization, America's top ally, and a cornerstone in every major global decision. But the 21st century, and especially the 2025 National Security Strategy, has laid bare a harsh truth. In the US-China rivalry, Europe no longer holds center stage. It has become the backyard, the marketplace, the dependent region, and at times even a strategic burden to Washington. For the first time, the NSS 2025 states bluntly that Europe must take responsibility for its own security. It's a diplomatic way of delivering a much colder message. The US no longer wants to foot the bill to defend Europe like it did during the Cold War. The war in Ukraine has cost Washington tens of billions of dollars, and the Trump administration, as the document describes, is no longer willing to pour resources into a continent that is economically weakening while expecting unconditional protection from America. Europe's greatest fear is becoming reality. The US is gradually pulling back, shifting its strategic focus to the Indo-Pacific, and leaving NATO to figure out its future largely on its own. This puts European nations in a painful paradox. They're being pushed to increase defense spending, yet remain almost entirely dependent on American weapons and technology. From radar systems and missile defense to fighter jets and command infrastructure, Europe cannot break away from Washington, even as it speaks of strategic autonomy. Worse still, the energy crisis following the Ukraine war exposed Europe's deep dependency on the US. When Russian gas was cut off, American LNG flooded European markets at 3 to 4 times the price, rocking industries in Germany, France, and Italy. Some analysts have said that in just 2 years, European industry has been Americanized to an unprecedented level. The US became Europe's supplier of energy, technology, defense, and even policy direction, turning the continent into a massive consumer market for American exports. Meanwhile, European corporations are in decline. Their tech lags behind the US and China. Their workforce is aging. Growth is slowing. Trapped between two superpowers, Europe no longer has the strength to compete, nor the autonomy to chart a different path. It has become a bystander in the clash of giants, not strong enough to shape the rules of the game, not agile enough to escape its dependencies. Some confidential reports go even further, describing Europe as an economic and political buffer zone between the US and Russia, between the US and China. It's not the board player, it's the board itself. And that board is shrinking as America's strategic gaze turns firmly toward the Pacific. But as Europe struggles to find its footing, there is one country where Washington's attitude is quietly evolving: Russia. No longer labeled enemy number one, Moscow is gradually being reimagined as a potential asset in America's new geopolitical calculus. From outright confrontation, Washington is now considering a strategic compromise, not out of trust in Moscow, but out of necessity, because the US needs a wedge to drive between Russia and China. And that idea leads us into the next chapter, where geopolitics becomes more complex than ever before. For decades, Russia has featured prominently in America's national security strategies as the primary threat. From the Cold War through the early 21st century, Moscow was the looming shadow Washington couldn't ignore. But in the 2025 national security strategy, a subtle yet profound shift occurs. Russia is no longer cast as the principal adversary. Instead, the lion's share of strategic focus is now reserved for China, the rival Washington sees as a systemic challenge to US dominance. This doesn't mean the US and Russia are becoming friends, but it does signal a realization in Washington. Russia no longer has the economic strength to compete long-term. Its military remains formidable, but its energy-dependent, sanction-strangled economy cannot sustain a global strategic threat the way China's can. As a result, NSS 2025 pivots from a strategy of defeating Russia to one of managing Russia, keeping it constrained, but not driving it fully into Beijing's arms. Internal analyses within Washington concede that the deepening Russia-China alignment after the Ukraine war was a strategic failure for the West. The combination of Russia's vast natural resources and China's industrial might creates a partnership the US would rather avoid confronting head-on. That's why America's long-term goal has shifted, to split Moscow from Beijing, even partially, or at least undermine the strength of their growing alliance through carefully calculated concessions. This is the underlying logic behind the loosely referenced concept of a strategic compromise partner in the NSS. To pursue this path, one condition must first be met. The war in Ukraine must end in a way that neither collapses Russia nor emboldens it. The US wants a Russia that is weak but stable. A total Russian collapse would leave a power vacuum in Eurasia, risking chaos and a potential unchecked Chinese expansion. But a reinvigorated Russia would continue to challenge the European order. Thus, a middle ground becomes the optimal US scenario. In Washington's calculus, Russia could evolve into a cooperative constraint, a role China once played for the US during its early reform era. Moscow might be invited to engage in arms control talks, negotiate Arctic power sharing, or participate in global energy coordination. In return, the US hopes to dilute Russia's reliance on China and prevent it from becoming Beijing's strategic enabler on the world stage. This shift explains why, even as the US ramps up pressure on China, its tone toward Russia has softened compared to the confrontational stance of 2014 to 2022. Washington hasn't changed its position on Crimea or Ukraine, but it now recognizes that in the grand game, the ultimate goal isn't to defeat Russia, it's to isolate China. And while the Russia-Ukraine front is a high-level geopolitical chessboard, there are two other theaters, the Middle East and Africa, that play a different role. These regions aren't arenas where the US seeks decisive victory. Instead, they serve as secondary stages, where the goal is simple: deny the enemy more ground. And that brings us to the next chapter, where resource wars, proxy influence, and shadow diplomacy unfold as a silent but ferocious competition between America and China in some of the world's most volatile and resource-rich frontiers. A glance at the priority map in the 2025 National Security Strategy reveals something unmistakable. The Middle East and Africa are no longer the central theaters of U.S. grand strategy. The era of large-scale interventions is over. Gone are the ambitions to rebuild nations or export American-style democracy. Today, Washington has only one objective in these two regions: to prevent China and Russia from putting down roots that are too deep. The Middle East was once the beating heart of U.S. foreign policy, primarily because of oil. But with American energy independence achieved through shale production, dependency on the Gulf has dropped dramatically. Washington doesn't plan to withdraw entirely, but it also has no interest in repeating long, grinding wars like Iraq or Afghanistan. Instead, the U.S. maintains a selective presence, focusing on Israel, Saudi Arabia, and maritime choke points like the Gulf of Aden. The primary goal is no longer control. It's to ensure the region doesn't become a power transit hub for China. Beijing is expanding its footprint through the Belt and Road Initiative, building ports, railways, and resource extraction projects. To Washington, this presence isn't threatening because of oil. It's because of strategic infrastructure, ports, trade corridors, telecom networks, all of which could one day serve as launch pads for China's global military ambitions. Thus, the U.S. aims to impede, not dominate, using regional alliances and diplomatic pressure to unravel agreements unfavorable to American interests. Africa, meanwhile, is a different story. Remote, often overlooked, yet packed with the resources that the 21st century craves: cobalt in the Congo, uranium in Niger, rare earths in Madagascar, oil in Nigeria, and natural gas in Mozambique. Over the past 2 decades, China has poured hundreds of billions into the continent, becoming the top trading partner for most African nations. The U.S. has no intention of trying to replace China in Africa. The gap is too wide. But it cannot allow China to monopolize strategic minerals either. That's why NSS 2025 focuses sharply on hotspots like the Horn of Africa, the Congo, and the Sahel, regions where resource competition plays out quietly among corporations, private military contractors, and state-backed interests. The U.S. doesn't need to win, it just needs to make sure China doesn't win decisively. This is the anti-monopoly strategy. Stretch out the game, fragment influence, and create just enough balance to force Beijing to spread itself thin. Zooming out, the Middle East and Africa are side stages in a much larger geopolitical drama. Because the U.S.-China rivalry has moved beyond traditional warfare into a new gray zone, where technology, semiconductors, artificial intelligence, data, and finance have become weapons sharper than aircraft carriers or ballistic missiles. And that brings us to the next turning point, where the face of conflict is no longer shaped by the sound of gunfire, but by lines of code, microchips, sanctions, and financial chokeholds, powerful enough to paralyze a nation overnight. In this new era, great wars no longer begin with the roar of tanks or the flash of missiles. They begin in silence, in the background hum of code, in the algorithms that govern data, in chips no larger than a fingernail that can determine the strength of an entire nation. That's why in the 2025 National Security Strategy, the United States defines technology as the ultimate weapon of the 21st century. Not aircraft carriers, not nuclear bombs, but artificial intelligence, semiconductors, supercomputing, new energy, and financial dominance. In this document, big tech, once criticized as monopolistic threats, is now described as a pillar of national security. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, and Nvidia have become strategic partners of the White House. The U.S. government doesn't just support them, it uses them as soft power weapons to maintain America's leadership in the digital sphere. Because in a world where everything is connected, power grids, defense systems, banks, logistics, he who controls technology controls the future. What worries Washington most is the pace at which China is closing the tech gap. As Beijing races ahead in AI, 5G, industrial robotics, renewable energy, and now domestically produced semiconductors, the U.S. understands that the competition can no longer be allowed to proceed unchecked. Weaponizing technology has therefore become not just an option, but a strategic necessity. Export bans on chips, EUV, lithography restrictions, semiconductor supply chain crackdowns, investment curbs on Chinese AI firms. These are not defensive measures. They are offensive strikes designed to stall China's rise. The U.S. aims to maintain enough of a technological lead to ensure that China never reaches parity. But it's not just about technology. Economics and finance have become silent battlegrounds as well. SWIFT, the US dollar, major banking networks, Wall Street, all have been transformed into instruments of state power. A single sanctions order can freeze billions of dollars in seconds, cripple corporations, or even kneecap an entire nation's economy. No power in human history has ever wielded this kind of capability, to wage war without firing a single shot. The US now understands that in the 21st century, victory doesn't require battlefields. A nation can be defeated if its supply chains collapse, if its tech is blocked, if its capital flows are isolated, or if its markets are manipulated. And in all these domains, America still holds the upper hand. NSS 2025 lays it out plainly. Preserving technological superiority is priority 1. Denying rivals equal footing is priority 2. And if necessary, the US will dismantle an adversary's tech infrastructure using non-military means. This is why the US-China rivalry today resembles no conflict from the past. It unfolds in the gray zone, not quite war, not quite peace. Each export ban, each investment restriction, each new piece of legislation is an invisible bullet aimed at the other side. And when technology becomes a weapon, when economics and finance become war zones, the world enters a new epoch, where the line between war and peace grows thinner than ever before. This is the foundation that leads us into the final chapter of the story, how Cold War 2.0 began and why it could last for decades, shaping the future of the entire world. When we connect all the dots, from America's supply chain reconstruction in the Western Hemisphere to its strategic encirclement in the Indo-Pacific, from the resource race in South America to the invisible wars over technology, a larger picture comes into focus more clearly than ever. The world has entered the era of Cold War 2.0. There's no Berlin Wall crumbling, no military alliances declaring open war, but all the elements of a prolonged confrontation are already in place. Two superpowers, the United States and China, are locked in a struggle over influence, technology, supply chains, allies, and the future of the global order. Cold War 2.0 differs from the 20th century version in that it permeates every corner of modern life. The battlefield is no longer just Europe or the Pacific. It's wherever internet cables run, wherever there's a strategic port, a rare earth mine, a semiconductor assembly line. In this world, power isn't just military. It's measured by control of data, 5-nanometer chips, and AI systems capable of predicting and influencing the behavior of millions. And in this landscape, America makes no secret of its ambition to stay number one. China makes no secret of its desire to rise as an equal. Both believe they are destined to reshape the global order. That's what makes this clash not just a passing storm, but a new era, one that could last decades, even generations. For middle powers, Vietnam, Indonesia, Turkey, Brazil, Saudi Arabia, the era of standing on the sidelines is over. They are now strategic pivots, courted by both giants. They face unprecedented opportunities, but also unprecedented risks. In a polarized world, one wrong move could drag them into a conflict they never asked for. But no matter how the big players maneuver, one truth is clear. The 21st century will be defined by the US-China rivalry. Not because two nations are clashing, but because they represent two models of development, two systems of values, two visions of how the world should be run. And when those models collide, every nation, big or small, will have to define its place in the new order. And now, as the 2025 National Security Strategy reveals the early outlines of this era, we can no longer deny it. Cold War 2.0 has begun. It's not loud, it's quiet, it doesn't explode, it accumulates. It isn't declared, it manifests in every economic shift, every tech sanction, every geopolitical move. The world is changing, and we must change with it. If you have your own take on this new era, drop your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more deep dive analyses like this one. This is just the beginning of an age full of uncertainty, but also full of opportunity for those who understand how the world truly works.